One of the absolute best ways to build the Onslaught in the latest Starsector patch is to run Shield Shunt. Now, Shield Shunt Onslaught has always been really good, and that's because the Onslaught has a very inefficient shield. And just removing this shield so that the Onslaught can fully focus its flux on weapons and use OP for armor and hull boosting hull mods is very, very effective. However, the Onslaught has also gotten a hidden buff in the latest patch, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But first and foremost, here's the Onslaught build. Shield Shunt, heavy armor, expanded magazines to boost TPC ammo capacity and recharge rate, armored weapon mounts, integrated targeting unit for the extra range, kind of a must. Also, we take ballistic rangefinder for extra range on the medium and small hardpoints. Reinforced bulkheads for extra hull. Flux distributor for a little bit extra flux dissipation. And automated repair unit for faster weapon and engine repair time. Also, we put on resistant flux conduits. This is for extra EMP damage reduction. I filled the large weapon mounts with neoferric quad coils. This is one of the new weapons which was added in the latest patch. This is actually a little bit less DPS than the Hephaestus assault gun. You can see it has 320 DPS compared to the Hephaestus, which has 480. However, the neoferric quad coil is much more flux efficient, and it uses a bit less flux at 320 per second compared to the 440 of the Hef AG. Also, we run a couple of light mass drivers, and same story here. These are quite flux efficient. And similarly, we run heavy mass drivers, and these are quite flux efficient with 140 flux per second and 200 damage per second. These are more efficient than hypervelocity drivers, and they only cost 2 more OP, and they even have more DPS than the hypervelocity driver. The only difference is that they don't really have any EMP damage, but this is not really a big deal. So we're using very, very flux efficient weapons on the Onslaught, and this is actually key for many of the new enemies in the game. The threat, for example, because fights with the threat are battles of attrition. They last a very long time, and you're constantly surrounded by enemies. The Onslaught is going to be constantly overfluxed. And so being able to squeeze every last bit of flux out of your ship that you can and be constantly firing your weapons and outputting as much DPS as possible, even despite tons of pressure, is extremely valuable. I've also filled some heavy machine guns in the medium slots. This is for a little bit of extra PD, although the Onslaught actually doesn't need a ton of PD. Now, the reason for that is because of this pairing with the Anubis class cruiser. Now, the Anubis is one of the new ships that was added in the latest patch, and I've set up this Anubis with expanded magazines. This is for extra charges and regeneration rate for the paladins. Hardened shields and stabilized shields, so we get much better and a bit more flux efficient shields. This is really important because the Anubis has terrible flux stats, so you really want to maximize the value of the flux that you have. ITU and advanced optics, and these boost the range of the Paladin PDs. Turret gyros. Now we do lose a little bit of turn rate from advanced optics, so we get a little bit back from advanced turret gyros. This is really nice. And also I've put on Escort Package. So the effect of Escort Package is when we're within 1,000 units of a larger friendly vessel, we get 25% maneuverability, 10% top speed, and also, this is really key, 20% range for our weapons, and that means 20% extra range for our Paladin PD system. So ITU, advanced optics, also gunnery implants if you have that on your commander, and 20% extra range from Escort Package. When you put a escort order on one of these Onslaughts, these Paladin PDs have absurd range, like absolutely ridiculous range. And this is basically going to be melting everything within a radius of the Anubis. And, you know, it's going to be close to the Onslaught, so everything within a radius of the Onslaught. And if you think about it, well, what are the weaknesses of a shield-shunted Onslaught? Well, missiles, torpedoes, fighters, and small annoying frigates that come and flank you from behind. And all of these things get essentially hard countered by the Anubis with Escort Package, which is going to have an insane amount of maneuverability and just be zipping around the Onslaught and just melting everything. Missiles, torpedoes, and frigates are just going to get absolutely shredded. So the Anubis covers a huge percentage of the Onslaught's weakness. Like pretty much most of the weaknesses of the Onslaught are just hard countered by the Escort Package Anubis. So Onslaughts with shield shunt, armor hull tank build, and you really want to maximize the flux efficiency of your weapons. The new threat weapons are pretty much perfect for this. If you don't have the Neopharics, then you could probably put Hephaestus assault guns there, and maybe rail guns instead of light mass drivers, and maybe hypervelocity drivers instead of heavy mass drivers. But otherwise, very flux efficient weapons, and all of this means that the Onslaught has incredible sustain. This thing is going to be soaking up and dishing out a ton of damage. We can go ahead and demonstrate this, maybe by taking a bunch of destroyers, a bunch of frigates, and in general, getting overwhelmed by a bunch of enemies from all sides. A lot of small destroyers and frigates. Well, that will destroy pretty much any ship. Like, there's not a lot of ships that can handle that situation really well. However, let's see the Onslaught together with its Anubis escorts and see how they handle this situation. So we see the Anubis cruisers have an extreme range on their Paladin PDs. We see harpoon missiles getting evaporated before they can even get close to the Onslaught. And the Anubis is simultaneously covering the flank of the Onslaught and keeping those frigates from getting too close and being too much of a nuisance. Meanwhile, the Onslaught is happily sitting here and dishing out a ton of damage with its very flux efficient weapons. It's not even reached max flux yet. However, if you are facing, for example, a threat fleet and you have this thing surrounded on all sides by threat ships, then you are going to be pretty much at maximum flux all of the time. So we can see the Anubis cruisers are just evaporating all of these fighters and all of these missiles. Even the small dumbfire rockets don't even make it to the Onslaught. Another thing you'll notice is that the AI on the Anubis is actually pretty intelligent, and with the extra maneuverability from Escort Package, it will actually use the Onslaught for cover. Like, it'll pop out and pop its temporal shell skill and spam its paladin PD, generate a bunch of flux, sometimes take some fire from enemies, and once it's near the flux cap, it will maneuver behind the Onslaught and kind of take cover behind the Onslaught. So this is extremely effective, this pairing of the shield shunted Onslaught with the Anubis. Especially if the Anubis has Escort Package. It's like the perfect escort. It's pretty much meant to be an escort and accompany a battleship like this, I would say. Anyway, that's enough of the sim battle. You get the point. I can show the overall fleet itself. I have 3 of these Onslaught shield-shunted battleships, 3 Anubis cruisers, so pretty much each Onslaught can get an Anubis escort. I also have a couple of Tempests, and this is a pretty standard Tempest build. Excuse me. And I'm running Graviton Beam and an Ion Beam, and also the Neutron Torpedo. This is one of the new weapons. And this is kind of, because there's only 2 ammunition. I don't really get a lot there, but, it's pretty decent. And the Tempest I mainly use for capturing points and just having a fast ship to carry out some orders, whatever I need done, capturing a point or, being an escort backup if needed. It's also pretty decent at taking out enemy frigates. But anyway, this is the Tempest build if you were curious about this. Nothing really super special. I also have the Onslaught Mark I. And the Onslaught Mark I is one of the new ships in the new patch. It doesn't really need a lot of elaboration because the ship is extremely powerful. If you've played on the latest patch, then you know that the ship is completely ridiculous. But anyway, I can show my build. I put a Storm Needler on the front, and the Storm Needler just pumps out an insane amount of shield DPS, and this is extremely strong when you follow it up with the heavy adjudicators. So the Storm Needler, and if you're close enough, these HMGs will just strip the shield, and then follow it up with the heavy adjudicators to completely shred the hull. I kept the Devastator cannons on the side. These are pretty good at dealing out HE damage to anything on the sides of the Onslaught Mark I. And they're pretty good also at dealing with fighters and taking out incoming missiles. For hull mods, I have expanded mags, and this is for extra adjudicator ammo. Heavy armor. I also built in shrouded mantle, Now, this is really, really nice for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Onslaught Mark I, one of the weaknesses, well, it's both an advantage and a weakness, but the Onslaught Mark I is an AI ship, and so you have to use a AI core as captain. And AI cores, as you probably know, have fearless personality, meaning that they are absolutely suicidal and they will jump into combat, they will jump headfirst into danger and just put themselves right in the center of enemy attention to dish out damage. Now, what does Shrouded Mantle do? Well, Shrouded Mantle, whenever the ship takes substantial hull damage, Shrouded Mantle will actually jump the ship back away from the source of damage. So this is really, really good for the Onslaught Mark I. If it's in danger of being destroyed, it'll actually kind of jump back a little bit. And the Fearless AI will pretty much just engage burn drive right away and speed back into the source of danger. So it's not like, you know, a perfect solution or whatever you could say, but it does actually mitigate this weakness a little bit. So it does help a little bit and delay if the Onslaught Mark I is about to die. But the other effect, if you S-mod Shrouded Mantle, is that you get 50% of the healing from Hungering Rift. So Hungering Rift, it heals Shrouded Dweller projections for 1,000 points anytime it hits hull or armor. And since we get 50% with Shrouded Mantle, that means we get 500 points of healing anytime this thing impacts hull or armor. And this really, really, really adds to the sustain of the Onslaught Mark I. In fact, if you're facing enemies and you land a lot of hits, then this thing becomes pretty much, well, unkillable. It will just heal itself constantly. And this is really amazing because this is like the only setup in the game that you can actually heal a ship with, like in a renewable fashion. Now, the Alpha Core, I've also put combat endurance, elite combat endurance on this. And so if you read the effect, it will repair 0.5% per second, and the total repair is the higher of 2,000 points or 50% of the maximum hull. So 50% of 42,000 hit points is 21,000, which is a lot of health. That's like a little bit less than, you know, an Onslaught. That's pretty much an Onslaught if you don't add reinforced bulkheads. So being able to heal an entire Onslaught's worth of HP is just completely insane. So it's kind of a no-brainer to put combat endurance on this. For the other mods, ITU for the extra range, armored weapon mounts, resistant flux conduits for less EMP damage, automated repair unit for faster weapon and engine repairs, flux distributor for a little bit extra flux dissipation. You want to get as much flux dissipation as possible on these battleships if you're facing the threat. And reinforced bulkheads. The Onslaught Mark I has an insane health pool, and adding reinforced bulkheads just boosts it to completely ridiculous levels. So maybe we can show this thing in combat a little bit. I'll put a bunch of destroyers and frigates, and we can watch the Onslaught Mark I do its thing. We can give it a couple of escorts as well. The Onslaught Mark I also benefits from Anubis escorts quite a lot. Now, what's special about the Onslaught Mark I is it has these VAM braces. So you know, when you read the armor stat, it's actually kind of misleading because in game, in combat, it actually spawns these separate armor entities, which the enemy actually has to punch through before damaging the Onslaught Mark I itself. We can see the Storm Needler actually melts frigates quite well on its own because the frigates don't really have great armor. So you can see the Storm Needler also strips the shields of destroyers and cruisers and pretty much anything very, very well. And that makes the ship pretty exposed to follow up with the heavy adjudicators. So we can see the Onslaught Mark I is also pretty much at maximum flux. It's been sitting there constantly. So again, you want flux efficient weapons on the Onslaught Mark I. It's especially important for the Onslaught Mark I because of the fearless AI. It's just going to dive headfirst into danger and pretty much be constantly overfluxed. I think the dissipation effect or the venting effect is really cool when you have Shrouded Mantle on. I don't know if we'll get to see the effect of Shrouded Mantle proc because this Onslaught Mark I is just completely shredding everything here. We can see the Anubis cruisers are also doing a really great job at covering the flank. And the Onslaught Mark I, you know, normally without the Anubis cruisers, the Onslaught Mark I would get surrounded and then something would come from behind and pop a Reaper torpedo right in the engine of the Onslaught. But the Anubis cruisers are doing a really good job of covering the flank. Keep in mind, anytime one of those Hungering Rifts hits hull or armor, the Onslaught Mark I is healing for 500 health points. It may actually be beneficial to put ECCM package on the Onslaught Mark I. I think the Hungering Rifts would benefit from the increased speed, so you're landing them on enemies more often. I haven't tried it with that. I considered it more important to put op into armor and hull boosting and basically more longevity for the ship and the weapons. But ECCM package might be a good option as well to make sure that these Hungering Rifts are actually hitting the target more often. As it is though, they land pretty frequently on enemies, as long as the enemies don't have too much PD. Anyway, that's this fleet pretty much defeated. This was, what was that, like 240 DP worth of enforcers and lashers. Not really too crazy because this is just a sim battle, but this fleet that I've shown is extremely effective versus the threat. You can see that in another video. And it's also extremely effective versus the remnants. It's not as effective against the remnants as it is versus the threat, but it is still very, very, very strong. Anyway, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed and strongly recommend giving a fleet like this a try. It is really, really fun playing with these shield shunted onslaughts.